Hello again, my name is Paul Gilbert, and we're looking at the way compassion can help us in these very difficult times. And this is talk 10, and we're going to be looking at mindfulness. Mindfulness is a very important skill for compassion. Okay, so I'm going to just share my screen with you as I normally do it, which means I have to lean forward, click on these various buttons. There we go, and there we go. Okay, so as you will see, attention and mindfulness go together. Now, just a little bit of background for my interest in mindfulness, which began back in the early 70s following the Beatles and the Maharishi and transcendental meditation and Om and incense and all of that. And I used to like to go and practice meditation. One reason was partly because young ladies used to go to these meditation classes at university, so I was kind of keen. But I followed up this interest for many years, primarily on the outside, just dabbling a little bit, but became very interested in mindfulness, and then had an opportunity to go and do some studies at a monastery called Samiling. There we are. And Samiling is a monastery in the borders. It's one of the first Tibetan monasteries that was set up in Europe when the Dalai Lama fled from Tibet for the invasion of the Chinese. And it follows the Tibetan traditions primarily. So that's where I learned a lot of my meditation techniques. And I was very lucky to be able to do that. And they hold retreats and conferences. And this is a conference that I was at. You can see me there right up in the top left-hand corner following a conference on compassion and Western science. This is where you can do your meditations. This is the throne room there, which is quite amazing. And they beat the drums and talk about and do chants on compassion, which is very lovely. 6 o'clock in the morning in February, it's pretty cold, but it's all very good. And in 2006, I met up with a Buddhist monk from here called Choden, and we wrote a book together called Mindful Compassion, where we try to link some of the traditional meditation insights into compassion with some of the Western scientific insights, and you can read that in the book there. And I was very lucky to be able to have a discussion with the Dalai Lama about the link between Western and Eastern approaches to compassion, and very much focusing on compassion for the dark side, because although people talk a lot about compassion in terms of helping us to feel happy and well-being, my interest has always been compassion for the parts and working with the parts that cause harm to ourselves or to others. So we had a nice discussion about compassion to the dark side, and you can see this as it's on YouTube if you want to. Just put Paul Gilbert and the Dalai Lama, and I think that brings it up for you. It's only a short 20-minute clip in the middle of a conference. Okay, so let's get back then to thinking about mindfulness in the context of understanding, having a scientific understanding of the mind, because I think when we have a scientific understanding of the mind, we can bring this into the contemplative traditions quite profitably, actually. So we've been talking about the fact that we have these algorithms that are built into us, and these are designed in us, as they are in other animals, so that when certain stimuli arise, then we are orientated to take certain actions. And these are built in. We need the biological wiring to be able to pay attention, to be able to notice, to be aroused in a certain kind of way, and to want to behave in a certain kind of way. There has to be biological systems to do that. And the one that we're interested in, of course, is the one at the bottom that's been evolving in mammals for many millions of years, which is this capacity to pay attention to distress and then be orientated to do something about it. Now, of course, we've been talking a lot that we are quite different because we also have this capacity for thinking and reasoning, so different to other animals, and we have very complex ways of being empathic, understanding the minds of the others, and having insight into our own minds. And we also have this amazing capacity, which is called the consciousness of consciousness. And this is really the basis of mindfulness. It's the basis of knowing intentionality. It's absolutely crucial to helping us understand how our minds operate, and gaining insight into the nature of our minds, and how do we use our capacities for being conscious of being conscious, to be able to observe the mind as it's unfolding. So this is the focus we have today, and this will allow us to have a way of relating safely to our own minds, because our own minds can be quite threatening to us. We can be quite threatened by some of the fantasies, by some of the powerful emotions that we have, and sometimes by self-criticism or the fear of other people or the fear of ourselves. So we're going to be looking at mindfulness in relationship to this, and certainly in relationship to compassion. So before I move on, I think it's quite important that we understand why mindfulness actually is so important in this day and age at this time, because this is how it all began. Around 560 BC, 560 BC, Siddhartha was born into a very wealthy kingdom, and the king wanted his son to be a great lord and king when he took over, right? And at his birth, there were various mystics, and the mystics said to the father, yes, your son will be a world leader and will go through the centuries, but not for his conquests, but for his spiritual guidance. And the father was not keen on this at all. Perhaps he was one of the early capitalists. And he decided that in order for his son not to be lured by the desire to address suffering, he would give him a golden palace to grow up in, where he wouldn't see suffering. Every need was met. And this is exactly what happened. So Siddhartha, which was his name, grew up in this golden palace, and all his needs were met. And he was always surrounded by happy, youthful people. And through his teens and early 20s, life was full of the pleasures of life, plenty of wine, women, and song. But he began to wonder about, is this all that there is then? And he noticed that his servants came and went, and he wondered, where did they go? And so he spoke to one of his trusted servants and said, well, is there nothing outside these walls? Then where do you go? And the servant spilt the beans and said, yes, there is another world outside of this one. And Siddhartha persuaded him, and it was very courageous of the servant, because obviously he could have been killed for his actions. He said, okay, I'll take you out and we'll show you the village. So early one morning at dawn, they sneaked out of the palace, Siddhartha and the servant. And on the road to the village, Siddhartha had three major experiences. The first one was he encountered somebody who was very old, and they were crippled and wrinkled and bent over a walking stick. And Siddhartha said to the servant, what is this? And the servant said, this is aging, Siddhartha. This is what happens to all of us. And Siddhartha said, even me? And the servant said, yes, even you. And the story goes that Siddhartha was so overcome by the suffering of this person, stooped over, struggling to walk, that he cried. And then they carried on down the road. There, laying on the side of the road, was somebody who was very ill, covered in sores, sweating, and in terrible pain. And Siddhartha said, what is this? And the servant said, this is disease and sickness, Siddhartha. All of us are vulnerable to this. And Siddhartha said, even me? And the servant said, even you are also vulnerable to disease and sickness. And Siddhartha, who had never seen anything like this, had never seen suffering, was so overcome by the pain of it that he cried. Carried on down the road. And there on the side of the road was a dead person. Sometimes the story says he saw a funeral, but in this story he saw a dead person. And said to the servant, so what's happened to this person? And the servant said, he has died, and explained death. Death is when we cease to exist. And Siddhartha says, even me? Can I die? And the servant said, yes, even you. You will one day grow old, and you too will die. And Siddhartha was so overcome by this new reality that he cried. At this point, he was in a state of shock. Today, we'd probably call it post-traumatic trauma, stress disorder. So he wasn't sure what to do. And then, coming down the road, he saw a sadhu, a holy man dressed in the robes. And very unsure, very uncertain, he said to the servant, so, but who's this person then? I've never seen anybody looking like this person. What's this person? And the servant said, well, this is a holy man, Siddhartha. This holy man gives his life to helping others and trying to find out the reasons for the suffering and how to end suffering. And when Siddhartha heard this, he said, okay, then so must I. Now, this is amazing, really, because nearly all of us would say, oh my God, it's a nightmare out here. I'm going back to my wine, women, and song. And we'd crack open a bottle, wouldn't we, really? But the point about it, the story is that it is the perception of suffering that starts the journey. The perception of suffering starts the journey. And we can all go back into our golden bubbles and forget all about it. We can forget about the suffering in the world, and we can just get on with our lives and enjoy our holidays and our red wine and our, and color televisions and fast cars. Or we can decide, actually, this is a time in human history when we must take the path of, I can't let this continue. We have to find a way to address suffering. And so he set off on his journey, and the journey took him to various places and to various traditions, yoga and so forth. At one point, he nearly starved himself to death because it was believed if you created starvation states of mind, you would get insight into the nature of the universe. But it didn't do very much for him, it just made him very ill. And then he began to understand there was a middle way. That in itself is an interesting story that you can find out. But for all the efforts that he put into his yoga and starvations and meditations and so forth, he was not really any clearer to understanding what the nature of suffering. And so he decided that he would try just to sit and meditate and meditate and meditate until he could get insight into the nature of suffering and the relief of suffering. And this became the motivation to find the source of suffering, and the release of suffering became the source of the journey of mindfulness. That was the whole point. That was the point of doing it, was to explore the source of suffering and the relief of suffering. And during the time of sitting under the Bodhi tree, some people say it was 24 hours, some people say it was 40 days, some people say it was longer, however long it was, he began to notice the arising and falling of experiences in the mind, things coming into the mind and going out of the mind. And he began to notice that there was a consciousness that was constant, an awareness that was constant, unchanging. And it was like a stage, and all kinds of things were floating across the stage, but the stage was constant. Or some people say it's like the blue sky. The blue sky is constant, and clouds come and clouds go, but the sky is constant. So Siddhartha had this insight, and that insight then gave him enlightenment into the distinction between the nature of mind, the nature of consciousness, and the contents of consciousness. And that became what was called the source of enlightenment, and that went with a number of other observations. So that was the discovery. So the insights were things such as, we can have pain of the inevitability of life, because life is in a constant flux. Nothing is the same. Every moment is different from the previous moment. Nothing is stationary, nothing is static. Everything comes into existence, everything goes out of existence. Things that we love come and go. So there is the inevitable pains of life, the diseases and the afflictions of life. But then there is how we respond to those diseases and afflictions, what our mind does with them. And this creates suffering, because sometimes we try to run from the inevitable, or in order for us to try and avoid focusing on the realities, we engage in all kinds of activities that are actually very harmful. And this sense of life being a source of pain, life is a source of pain, life is a source of disappointment. And our reaction to that is called dukkha, okay? So dukkha is really the suffering we experience from the awareness of pain and our efforts to try to run for it or stop for it or whatever. Freeing ourselves then comes from, how can we free ourselves from unnecessary suffering? Now, we can't free ourselves from pain, okay? I mean, if I fall over and break my leg, I'm going to get pain. But there may be ways in which we can orientate our minds to pain such that we don't have to have unnecessary suffering, so we don't have to have dukkha. And this means that we need to explore the nature of the mind that is experiencing pain. And this brings us into this whole issue again about trying to understand the nature of our programming. What is our minds, how our minds work, what are they made to do? And this also takes us into the nature of consciousness itself. So the two aspects really to this is understanding what your mind is and how it works, and understanding the consciousness that is aware of this mind. And part of this is to help us to let go of our self-identifications, the sense of a self, the sense of a solid self, and to focus much more on this issue of consciousness, of being conscious, this awareness of being aware. The whole nature of consciousness itself becomes the issue of our attentional focus, rather than me, me, me. So that means we need to understand attention. What do we pay attention to? What is grasping our attention? So mindfulness is very much about where your attention is, your body goes. Where your attention is, that is what can fill up your conscious space. Your consciousness can be filled up by what you're paying attention to. So we also recognize that attention can be moved, okay? Attention is not fixed. So I could ask you to focus on your left foot, or your right ear, or the tip of your nose, or bring to mind a memory of your holiday. And you can just move your attention at will to a physical aspect of yourself or to a memory. And we also know that attention is like a spotlight, that it enhances what it focuses on. So if you focus on your left foot, you suddenly become aware of sensations in your left foot. If you focus on a memory of your holiday, your mind is suddenly filled with images and recalls and emotions associated with that holiday. So your attention opens up your mind becomes open and focused. It's like a zoom lens, it becomes magnified, and attention magnifies it. And attention works on physiological processes too. What we pay attention to has very major impacts on our bodies and our minds. And we saw this in an earlier talk when we looked at the way in which, if you focus on a meal when you're hungry, you imagine a meal or you focus on a meal, this will stimulate your stomach acids. If you have imagery or thoughts or going on something a bit erotic, a bit sexual, that will stimulate your pituitary and give you arousal in the body, and so on. So we can, the point about it is that we become mindful of where our attention is and what it's doing, because it is running our show. And if we just let it run itself, then sometimes it can take us into places that are not very helpful. So mindfulness then is this awareness of the modes through purposely paying attention, to paying attention on purpose, excuse me, in the present moment. So paying attention to what's happening in your mind, what's going on in the mind at the moment, non-judgmentally. You're not trying to push it away or stop yourself from thinking or fighting with your mind. Key thing about mindfulness is don't fight with your mind. Learn to be with your mind, understand what's arising, but don't start fighting with it, because that gets you into trouble. And then by being aware of the present moment, that gives you options of what you can do. Now, from a evolutionary point of view, we can say that mindfulness is to become aware of my tricky mind and body as programmed, okay, filled with desires, wants, emotions, moods, thoughts, okay, which is being built for me, not by me. And I'm going to become aware in order for me to try to live helpfully, not harmfully. In other words, mindfulness, becoming aware of what's going on as it's going on, is aware of us becoming aware of the programming, our programming, what programs are being run in our minds. And then we have choice. Do we want to let those programs act out their behaviors or not? Because remember, right at the beginning, we said we have algorithms. When something is triggered, there'll be a tendency to want to behave in a certain kind of way. Okay, that's the key. But when you become mindful, you see these programs working in you. Now you have a choice. You don't necessarily need to act on them in the way that the program is written inside of you. You run your programs. They don't run you. And that's very important. More difficult than it sounds, but that's the steps that we take. And this helps us to grasp the essential nature of what minds we have, the nature of consciousness. So when we're doing mindfulness, then we're getting mindful insights into the nature of mind. We always ask the question, mindful insight into what? Mindful insight into your mind, but what? What is your mind? What are you getting insights into? And the point is that you're getting insights into nature's mind, because remember, you've got a mind that's been built like all the other trillions of humans exactly the same way. And your mind is more or less filled with the same sorts of programs as all the other humans that have ever existed, more or less. So we're getting insight not into something personal, but in something that nature has built. We're getting insight into the algorithms of nature's mind. Now, this is very important because that means there are two types of mind. We have what we call the collective mind, or what Jung called the collective mind. And here we have many shared dispositions, both conscious and unconscious. And these are our impulses and fantasies and dreams. And we share those right across humanity, okay? We have the same desires. We want to be happy. We don't want to suffer. We want to be loved. We don't want to be hated. We want to have sex. We don't want to be excluded. We have the same basic desires as other humans. We want to, have children we can love and so forth. And this is why we can have authors who write fictions and stories and so forth, because they're telling the stories of what it is to be human, all the different types of plots and the villains and the heroes, and that's all part of being human. That's all written into us. These are all archetypal programs, right? And they are the source of things that are fearful and the source of things that are inspiring. So nature's mind then is a built mind that we share with each other, and becoming mindful means we can start to get insights into the nature of nature's mind. But there's also a personal mind, and this is the mind that's only you can experience because it's to do with your unique patterning of the archetypal mind by your genes and your experiences. So remember the example I gave that if I'd been kidnapped as a 3-day baby into a violent drug gang, this version of Paul Gilbert wouldn't exist. A very different version, a violent Paul Gilbert, and that Paul Gilbert's mind would be filled with completely different types of fantasies and so forth. In terms of the person, not completely different in terms of the collective, because humans have all these fantasies, don't they? Game of Thrones, if you've watched that. But in terms of the personal memories, personal reflections, things that only I could have experienced because they were my personal experiences. And these also become points of consciousness. So there are two types of consciousness, two types of processes that we become consciousness, conscious of. That is something that is collective, that part of the collective mind, part of the universal mind, part of the mind that all of us have, our desires for love and affection and status and all that stuff, but then also some of the personal stuff. And the personal stuff can be the stuff that really causes us a lot of trouble as well, particularly if we've had experiences of abuse and so forth, because that overstimulates the threat system, and then we become very dominated by, say, threat processing. So let's have a think about this then. If we develop mindfulness, if we develop the ability to begin to pay attention and observe what's going on, then we can begin to observe these systems activated as they're activated, okay? So mindfulness really is learning to pay attention, okay? And paying attention in a certain kind of way so that you know what is happening inside of you when it's happening inside of you. So for example, when you're getting angry, you're aware you're getting angry, and that you will be aware that you'll be mindful of the fact that when you start to get angry, you'll start to pay attention in a certain kind of way. Your thinking will go off in a certain direction. Your body will experience anger in a certain kind of way, and you'll want to do things in a certain kind of way. Because that's the program. That's how the damn thing's been written for you. You're experiencing it. The question is, are you just going to let that program run? Or now that you're aware of it, maybe you want to do something else. And of course, it's the same with anxiety, right? When we get anxiety, we feel anxious, I'm anxious. But we know it's a program running in us, and we know it's going to direct our attention in a certain kind of way. We're going to tighten up in the body where, we want to go to the toilet a lot. We know this, okay? So your mindfulness guides you that, and that's your third one. These are the big three that we talk about. So when we become mindful, right, we become aware. Here are the big three. This is what they think. This is what they do. Now, this is very important for our point of view, because sometimes mindfulness people will say, oh, well, just a thought is just a thought, or just see it floating down the river. For us, a thought is never just a thought, if only, because these are programs that are firing off in your mind, right? And sometimes they're pretty they're pretty tight, they're pretty heavy stuff, right? If anger fires off in my mind, it's not just a thought, I'm being stimulated by this whole program. And if we understand that, then it makes it easier, not easy, for us to begin to recognize that we have to work with this system in different ways. I have to work my body. That's why I do the breathing, or I might need to take activity. I have to work my thinking, and I have to work my impulses and so on. I have to work what I pay attention. I can switch my attention. I can do different behaviors. So now, once I see what's happening, I can make choices about what I'm going to do. So this is extremely important. Mindfulness is the way of paying attention, beginning to notice. And when we begin to notice, when we pay attention, when we look in on what's going on in the mind, then we can get to know one's programming, and then we can start to think and behave wisely, helpfully, not harmfully, okay? So that's how it works. And we do the same with our desires and our motives, that we can begin to pay attention to what we want, what we need, what we're hoping for, okay? And then either allowing those desires to run or recognizing that sometimes those desires are helpful, sometimes they're unhelpful, okay? So the desire to make loads of money might not be so helpful. The desire to cheat may not be helpful behavior, okay? So the point about it is learning to pay attention to the nature of your mind. Now, I love this story because Dalai Lama told us this story. I was in one of his teachings. It was hundreds of people there at the time, many years ago, I can't remember when. And he told this lovely story about mindfulness. And the story goes like this, that when he was a young man, in his teens and still in Lhasa in Tibet, he used to like to fix wristwatches, you know, a wristwatch, like things like this. And he used to take the wristwatches from the travelers who came to Lhasa to see him. And one day he was fixing this beautiful watch, and at the last moment he dropped a screw into the watch, right into the mechanism, and he suddenly realized that that was, you know, 3 weeks' work or whatever it was. And in that moment he went, which is Tibetan for shit. He picked up the hammer and smashed the watch, right? Bash. So of course we all sort of sat in the audience, you know, all hundreds of us go, like this. And he smiled, as he does, and said, well, so you see the thing then, in that moment of mindlessness, I had done exactly the opposite of my true intention. My true intention had been to fix this beautiful watch, and now I had destroyed it. And that's the point of mindfulness. The first point of mindfulness is becoming sufficiently aware of the rages and the passions and the desires of our mind that are unhelpful or hurtful, and being able to choose to act helpfully, not harmfully. So I think it's a lovely story. It makes the point very, very easily and simply. So becoming aware of the mind and remembering, do not blame yourself for your programming, okay? That would be to make you God or something, or, you know, a programmer. The only thing we can do is to pay attention to the system, and then by becoming mindful and aware, and then we can make choices. But if we're not really that mindful, it's very difficult, because these programs are designed to run themselves, okay? All animals run the programs. They don't have a choice. They can't be mindful. They have to act according to what's stimulated in them. But humans don't. And the whole point of enlightenment is to become aware of this reality, that you do have a choice, but you're going to have to train your mind to notice and to choose. Now, the other point that's key about this is that if you choose compassion as your motivation, as your guide in life, then mindfulness becomes the way of helping you pay attention when you're veering off course, as you will, and we do, okay? So when we're actually finding the impulses, the desires, and the emotions are moving us away from our compassionate attention, mindfulness allows us to say, hang on a minute, I want to come back on this. It's like steering down the motorway. When you begin to realize you're just moving into another lane, then bring yourself back to the where you want to go. It takes practice, it really does. So, as I say, you know, I do try to practice my compassion, attention. My wife still says I'm a grumpy old bugger, but there we are. So this is very important. So the other thing I want to say to you about mindfulness is about what's coming into mind or what is in mind and what's getting stuck there. Sometimes it gets stuck because we ruminate or we're in very difficult situations or whatever. And once again, it's never about blaming, because blame won't do anything, will it? Okay, it's understanding the causes of something, that's for sure, that's important. But then making the intention to now behave as helpfully as we can. Shaming and attacking oneself or whatever doesn't usually help, okay? It just makes us feel bad. But what's also very important is to be aware of what is not in consciousness, what has gone out of consciousness. And this is important because if you remember the story of the Christmas shoppers, you know, we go Christmas shopping and there were 10 shops and 9 people are really lovely to us and one person is incredibly rude and unhelpful. The chances are your mind will focus on that one. And so what you do is you forget, you've forgotten, you've put out of mind the 9 people who are really helpful to you. They're not in your mind because you're so focused on the one that really irritated you. So mindfulness is a way of remembering the 9 that were helpful to you. Hold on to the positive, right? Hold on to the helpful. Let that which is helpful to you nurture your mind, okay? Bring your attention to those people who have been helpful to you, not just the ones who have not, okay? It's very easy because your programming will orientate you to focus on threat. That's what it's designed to do. If you do that, it's not your fault, right? But you need to kind of steer the wheel back so that you bring more of a positive focus into your mind. So just be aware that sometimes it's what's gone out of mind that's important to focus on, not just what is in mind. And this is the key thing here, right? Okay. And once again, when we do this, this allows us to begin to think wisely, to be able to realize that we need to balance our minds, to bring our minds to a focus on what is helpful. Because remember, previously, that what you focus on will affect your body. Okay, very important. So our observer mind really then is there to support insight and to support empathy and compassion. And when it does that, when you do that, you remember from the talk we had on the body, then you will be stimulating body systems that will help you. You'll be stimulating your vagus nerve, you'll be stimulating oxytocin states and so on. So that's kind of how it works. The other thing about the observer mind is that when we deliberately practice compassion, like maybe if you sit for 10 minutes or 20 minutes a day and you just practice focusing on compassion intention, or you practice imagining a compassionate other being close to you or dialoguing with you, this one also will stimulate systems in your brain that are going to help you. And if you strengthen them up, then they will be there for you when you need them. So let's have a look at this now then. There are various types of mindfulness practices that you can try. There is what we call focus concentrated practices, okay? And this can be things like focusing on the breath, on a sound, on things that you're doing, the body. So if you focus on the breath, this is fairly straightforward. All you do is you sit and you just focus on the feelings of breathing in and breathing out. Sensations of breathing in, breathe, and your attention is totally held on the experience of the breath and the movement of the breath in the body. You can do mindfulness of sound, where you just listen to a sound, or it could be a piece of music, and just practices just listening to the sound. Because what you're doing in mindfulness is just focusing your attention and not getting caught up in thoughts and all of that stuff of the new brain, okay? In the old traditions, we would focus on, say, a candle. When we were doing it back in the 70s, you like to count, you had to focus on, keep your attention on the candle, noticing the changes of the candle, the flickering of the light. The light is never the same, you know, that would do those sorts of things. So this is how to practice focusing and concentrating your mind. Now, one of the things that can be quite useful to do is to see how chaotic your mind is by simply sitting and practicing paying attention to the breath and see how long you can do that before you have a thought like, what am I going to have for lunch? Am I supposed to phone James tomorrow? Okay. Noticing that you have what we call a grasshopper mind, a hoppity mind. Again, don't blame yourself, it's all right. But if you practice learning to pay attention to specific processes, this will help you. We can also do what is called explorative, focused, or concentrative. Now, this is things like mindful eating. Now here, what you do is you start to explore by being completely focusing your attention on something like eating. So supposing you were going to eat an orange, okay, then you would look at the colors of the orange. You'd really study the different oranges, the textures. You'd feel the pitted nature of the orange. Begin to peel the orange. You'd notice how the pith is around the orange, what's inside the orange, and then gradually opening the orange, smelling the orange, really paying attention to your senses, really focusing fully attention on this experiences of eating the orange. And you put the orange into your mouth and you would taste it. Okay, and then gradually experience the feeling of the saliva, where the orange goes, what it's like, and then the experience of swallowing the orange. Okay, so this is a sensory, and of course there are many other ones you can do. You know, there are many workshops you can go on which are called tantric sex, and basically this is the same thing. You're mindfully paying attention to the sensations of sexual experience, so rather than rushing forward and doing whatever. Now this is important because a lot of the time when we're eating and when we're doing things, we don't do them mindfully. You know, we're eating, but we're also thinking, reading the papers, listening to the radio, planning the day. We're never present in what we're actually doing, okay? So mindful sensory focusing, okay, where you're focusing on the sensation, gives you a way of actually focusing your mind on exactly what you're doing in this moment. Very important. Another form of mindfulness is called open mindfulness, and this is where we pay attention to what's arising in our minds as it's arising. We become familiar with the risings of the thoughts and the risings of the feelings, and this is a meditation where people can just literally sit and just pay attention to whatever arises. Now this can be very helpful when it comes to learning to pay attention to what's going on in you when you become angry or happy or joyful or desirous, by just learning how to notice what arises in you as it arises in you. Now, some of the practice concentrative meditations that can help you, but this one is particularly important, okay, particularly important, of learning to be open to and familiar with the contents of your mind. And that's why for us, we always suggest that mindfulness should always be accompanied by mind awareness. Because if you're not aware of all the stuff going on in your mind, if you're not aware that you have a mind that's being built for you, not by you, then sometimes we can get fantasies, pretty horrible fantasies or scary fantasies, and they're not aware of how come I could think that. Well, because it's being built into you. That's how people write all these horror stories, isn't it? Because we all have these capacities to generate these things. It's not your fault. Then we can have what we call directed mindfulness. Now this is important because this would be things like loving kindness meditations, where we focus on a particular kind of practice, right? Now in loving kindness meditations, we might bring to mind somebody we care about, or then a friend, and then maybe somebody we're not so happy with. And we practice focusing on the potential experience of suffering and the wish for suffering to end. Now remember, the story begins, the Siddhartha story, the Buddha story of the Buddha begins with the pursuit of the ending of suffering. That's where it began. So now you're right back at the beginning with loving kindness, aren't you, in a way, of actually this deep desire for the person, for their suffering to end. So that's what you're focusing on, right? When you're doing compassion meditations, that's again what you're focusing on. You're focusing on finding the compassionate courage and wisdom to be able to find the relief of suffering. Now, if you can find the relief of pain as well, that's great. But suffering, remember, is the suffering that we cause because of the way in which we're dealing with pain. And the other thing important about mindfulness is actually in the Pali, it also means, in the original languages, it also means to remember to be mindful, okay? To remember to be mindful, because this is a trick really, because, you know, you can sit and practice mindfulness, but then when you get to work and you get into an argument with your boss or something, you've forgotten about mindfulness and you're just raging away or whatever it is. Was remembering there are certain times it's really important to pay attention to what's happening, what's going on inside of you. And this allows you to live to your intentions. The more you remember to be mindful, the more you can live to your intention, okay? Now, mindfulness can be used for many, many things, right? You can have a mindful violin player or whatever it is. So the motive is up to you. But remembering to be aware, to do things on purpose, to be fully aware of what you're doing as you're doing it, when you're doing it, that is really crucial. But you have to remember to do that. And last but by no means least, mindfulness is a way of what we call having the deep dive. Now, the deep dive is what many of the more mystical traditions are really interested in. This is in a way what the Buddha was really interested in the end, which is into the subtleties and the complexities of consciousness itself. And the idea is that when you allow your mind to settle, when you engage in meditations that allow your mind to settle, so all the chatter, thinking, planning, worry, when that part of your mind called the default code settles down, okay, when your mind becomes, as it were, empty, okay, then you begin to experience more subtle levels of consciousness. Okay, sometimes it's said that, you know, your mind is like a cork bouncing on the sea, and it's just bouncing all over the place. But as we allow ourselves to engage in mindfulness and allow the mind to settle, then the cork begins to descend into the lower levels, into deep stillness. And in those stilling of the mind, that settling of the mind, we begin to experience different subtleties of the nature of this consciousness realm itself. Okay, consciousness of consciousness. Now, that is more advanced stuff, and you'd have to go off to more advanced teachers to be guided through that. But that is one of the aims of mindfulness practice, is to become more in tune with the nature of mind itself, the nature of consciousness itself. And the thing is, consciousness is a strange thing, because we only exist in the present moment. We only exist now. And we don't actually exist in the moment to come yet, because it hasn't arrived, is it really? And as for the moment just gone, well, we don't exist there because it's gone. And when we think about it, consciousness itself is actually empty. Now, a colleague Matthew Ricard was also a very famous Buddhist monk, uses this lovely example. He says that, you know, water can carry a poison or a medicine, but it is neither of those things. And consciousness is like that, you know. So there is the consciousness versus the experiences arising in consciousness. We are conscious, but then there's the content of consciousness, the patterns in the mind, right? So consciousness is, in a sense, just consciousness. That's what it is, it's consciousness. But what comes into consciousness, what we are conscious of, might be anger or relaxation or desire or hunger or satisfaction. These are just patterns that are flowing through the domain of consciousness. And the idea of mindfulness is gradually to become aware of the patterns, not to be absorbed in the patterns and think that the patterns are the game. Because in the contemplative traditions, consciousness is the game. Everything else is content. And remember, content was built for you anyway. Content was built because you have genes that will build it. You have programs that will fill it. So mindfulness then is this way of understanding the expansiveness, the nature of consciousness. But that is more advanced technique. So you're not going to necessarily get much into that unless you practice reasonably hard for a while. Okay. So here's a little cycle for you. Firstly, we can be choosing an attentional focus like the breath or a sound or whatever it is. And then we notice that our mind has wandered off all over the place. What's really quite important is that when you notice distraction, because that's the problem, is notice your reaction to your distraction. So that's the second level of noticing, and noticing if you're getting frustrated or self-critical. And the idea is to notice it without engaging with it, and then gently let go of that and come back to choosing where you want to pay attention. Okay, choosing where you want to pay attention. And this is the cycle of mindfulness. Now, people often say, oh, I'm not very good at it, I can't do mindfulness. And that's because they haven't understood it. Okay, mindfulness has no end. It doesn't have an outcome. Outcomes will come, but there is no focused outcome. The outcome is not really to settle the mind. The mind will settle. It's like sitting in the, sitting in a muddy pond. If you sit in a pond of mud, okay, just sit quietly, the mud will gradually settle. It will do it by itself. But you can't make it. You can't force it. It's not an outcome you can make happen. So mindfulness is a little bit like that. So the thing is, mindfulness simply noticing and just becoming aware that my mind has wandered, and then bring it back. That's it. You're not trying to empty your mind or do anything. If your mind settles, it'll settle because you're doing this noticing and returning, noticing and returning. Notice it. But the moment you start to think to yourself, oh, I need to settle mind, then of course you've got a thought that's come in that will pull you away from that experience. So if people tell you, oh, I'm not very good at mindfulness, it's because they haven't understood it. Because if they are understanding that they have a jumpy, hoppy mind, then they have done mindfulness. That's it, isn't it, really? Then they understand it. Okay, I can't do mindfulness because my mind's all over the place. How do you know? The only way you could know is you've been mindful to the fact your mind is all over the place. It's like that, isn't it, really? All right, so there have been many efforts to describe the different facets by which we can begin to develop mindfulness. And one of them I quite like is Ruth Brayer's, and she suggested 5 facets of developing mindfulness for ourselves. And this is observing, attending, and noticing. So beginning to observe what's going on in your mind, or what's going on in the world, or what's going on in relationships, for example. Describing, okay, labeling your observing, putting words to it, really understanding, oh, I can see that, and that's what I'm paying attention. That's what I'm paying attention to. So this is an orange. Now I'm paying attention to the orange, and I can taste its sweetness and whatever. Describe is observe, describe, and do it non-judgmentally. So, for example, if you taste an orange and it's actually quite bitter, the idea is just to notice, oh, this orange has a bitter taste to it, okay? As opposed to, oh my God, why did I buy these oranges? For goodness sake, they're horrible. Why would they sell these kind of stuff, right? I'm not going to buy those again. I'm not going back to that shop, because that's all chatter, 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 okay? So if you get an orange that's a little bitter, that is now part of your experience. It's part of your experience. Non-judgmental experience, okay? Very important. But, and here's the thing, remember the Dalai Lama and the watch, acting with awareness, and importantly, non-reactivity, not just acting out internal experiences, but recognizing that from no fault of your own, it's not your fault, but your programs can lead you to behave harmfully. They can lead you into loops in the mind that are not going to be helpful to you. And that's a struggle, that's really, really tough. That's really, really difficult. So we learn to pay attention, to notice what is arising as it's arising, to be able to start to be aware of this, whether this is helpful or not helpful, and try as best we can. It's not always easy. I certainly lose my temper from time to time, to be helpful. Now, people often say, oh, well, what about are you mindful when you're going to the pictures then? Well, there will be times when absorption is very, very important. We can be absorbed in an activity. We kind of lose ourselves in that moment without thinking, like going to the movies or whatever. And sometimes absorption, in other words, not being fully aware, but just lost in the experience, can be extremely important, because if you go to the movies and you're sitting there kind of, I'm mindful now, sitting in my seat and watching the movie unfold before me, I'm watching so-and-so act, and what you start labeling everything. See, then you've wasted your money because you're not going to enjoy the movie, are you really? So everything about mindfulness is really understanding that the way you're using these capacities for paying attention is very important. The intention, of course, the intention and the attitude of mindfulness is the key thing here. So as I say, consider when it's helpful to be absorbed, to be in the moment, to be there, and at times when to become fascinated, okay, to be lost in fascination, to be lost in awe, to be lost in wonder, okay. These are all really quite important elements of working with our minds helpfully. So here is mindfulness on the go then, which is remembering to notice, to attend to living to one's intentions. So as best we can, each morning we make the intention to try to live helpfully, not harmfully. And if we notice that we're not, the idea is just to notice the distraction and bring yourself back on course as quickly as you can. And once again, just to be aware, if you go in full frustration and getting angry with yourself, notice that and then kindly let it go and come back to with living by your intention, right? In living to compassion intention is not always easy because there's so many things inside of us that can pull us away. It's not always easy. So here we go. This is a diagram that we use quite a lot. So at number 1 then, we have the beginning of mindfulness, the beginning of learning how to pay attention, how to notice, okay? Learning to be aware of things that we do as we're doing them. Number 2 is that we are mind aware. In other words, if you've been following the talks along so far, you will be aware of what your mind is, how it's being built, the kinds of emotions that exist within it, the sorts of programs that can get you into trouble, the ways in which we can think, black and white thinking, jumping to conclusions that we did in number 7, I think, or 8 or 7, the way in which we can think. We're aware of this now. We become mindfully aware. And this allows us then to see the way in which the new brain and the old brain can interact. You know, how we stimulate unhelpful emotions, or if unhelpful emotions have been stimulated, the way we think about them can make them worse or make them better, can help us or get in the way, right? Our thinking about what's happening inside of us can cause trouble, or it can be helpful. And then at the bottom, we see that we can guide the whole ship through this compassion motivation. That's the motivation. That's the direction of travel, right? To find the courage and the wisdom to try and deal with things when they get tricky for us, when they get painful and we're suffering and we're confused, as best we can, to try to find the courage and the wisdom to guide us through. And that's when we use our mindfulness and awareness and our information about our minds to guide us and help us with those loops that we get stuck in, which we all do. We all get stuck in loops, don't we? It's just part of the way life is, right? Not your fault. Always remember, not your fault. But only you can learn to steer the ship of your own mind. So in general then, summing up for this talk, which has been a little longer than the other ones, the great mystery in the universe, right, is this issue of consciousness. Physicists are thinking about some very, very odd things in the physical world when you get down to it. We don't really understand this issue of consciousness, but we do know that we can use it. It's a faculty that humans have that we think other animals don't have, but our society doesn't teach you how to use this faculty. It doesn't teach you how to become mindful. Increasingly, there's some very wonderful people are going into schools and other places teaching the basis of mindfulness to kids, which is amazing because I was taught nothing like that when I was a kid. Teaching them how to pay attention to what's going on in the mind, non-judgmentally. And the question about consciousness is, which everybody's asking, is it a biological trick? Is it just part of biology? Because very clearly, if you damage the brain, then your experience of consciousness is different, isn't it? If you take drugs or something, your experience of consciousness is different. So clearly, the contents of consciousness, and to some degree, the strength of consciousness is biological, isn't it, really? Or is consciousness more of a dimension, more of a field? No one knows. It's unknown, but it's interesting. Mindfulness and the deep dive into the levels of consciousness and the subtleties of consciousness are important. And so I don't want to strip out of mindfulness the real other aspects to it that we can't cover here, that you would need then to go and have proper teachers and guides to take you into those dimensions. This is simply, this approach to mindfulness is pretty straightforward. It's just the ways in which we learn to pay attention to our minds so that we can live to be helpful, not harmful. That's what we've been doing today. But there are much deeper levels to this that you could go and explore if you wanted to. And there are many different approaches and forms. Now, many of the meditators will use all kinds of examples to get this across. This is important because when you go on the deep dive into consciousness, one of the things that you can have a sense of is the interconnectedness of all things. And the Buddhists tell some lovely stories, about this, and it's all about the nature of form. And one story is that of the snowflake who was fluttering through the through the sky, marveling at its infinite complexity of structure and how it's shape and so forth. And then it hits the sea. And one that I love, that was told by me when I was in America by a very lovely guy, was this: there are two waves rushing towards the cliffs, and they've come right across the Atlantic or wherever, and they've been riding together like this. And the big wave suddenly says to the little wave, "Oh no, it's finished. Our journey is finished. There are rocks ahead and cliffs ahead. It's all foam. We're going to be turned to foam. It's just foam everywhere." And the little wave says, "You don't need to worry. It's okay." And the big wave says, "That's only because you're a little wave and you can't see in front of you, whereas I can see we're going to be turned to foam." And the little wave says, "Yes, but you're not a wave, you're water." Thank you very much.